The word shortage seems to have a pretty clear meaning, but you might be surprised how much confusion this one word can cause. For example, people often think that the gasoline shortage of the 1970s was caused by America running out of gas, but this couldn't be further from the truth. The definition of shortage is a state or situation in which something needed cannot be obtained in sufficient amounts, which, by that definition, the 1970s gasoline shortage was only a shortage for people in cars looking for gasoline, because the gas stations had no problem finding gasoline. As a matter of fact, the amount of oil available only shrunk by about 5%. Now, I know this might sound backwards. Why were there lines around the block to get gasoline? Why was there a major panic for everyone to get gas if there wasn't actually much scarcity? And why would the gas companies pull such a diabolical trick on the American people? Well, the answer is that it wasn't a trick by the American gas companies to get people to buy more gas, or to buy gas at a higher price. It was actually caused by Richard Nixon's price controls, along with the news of a gasoline shortage causing overall panic amongst Americans, leading to scarcity behaviors. This led to a sort of run-on-the-bank-like situation, and it affected a lot more than just gasoline. Now, this was a terrible economic strategy, but if you're a creator and you're looking for a great marketing strategy, check out DankSphere, your one-stop solution for all your production and marketing needs. They create custom social media strategies tailored to your brand's goals, manage your accounts, attract new followers, and connect with your community. Their content creation services navigate trends with high-quality content and authentic storytelling. From scroll-stopping videos to dynamic, value-driven posts, DankSphere has you covered. Also, their copywriting and editing, as well as digital campaign services, can also come in handy if you're looking to improve your social media and website copy to reach new audiences. If you're in need of more one-on-one guidance, their consulting services help you gain insights into your marketing strategy. As published podcasters, they also bring an extensive background in podcasting to the table, as well as 16 years of experience in film, TV, commercial production, and digital marketing. So if you're looking to make your story a success, check out DankSphere in the link in the description. Okay, now back to the video. There were multiple events that led to the many shortages and the monetary issues of the 1970s. And it all started in the 1960s during Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency with the Vietnam War and the highly questionable Great Society policies of 1964 and 1965. The war and the massive increases in government welfare spending caused an inflationary recession in the US as more currency was put into circulation due to money printing and borrowing, and as higher taxes were imposed on the American people. In 1968, Richard Nixon won the presidential election, and in an attempt to fix the inflationary issues caused by LBJ's monetary policies, he passed the Economic Stabilization Act of 1970. The act put an automatic 90-day freeze on wages, rents, and prices across the country to reduce inflation. After the 90 days were up, you would have to be approved by the government pay board and a price commission to be able to raise prices, making the everyday lives of business owners beholden to government bureaucrats. Also, because the controls were supposed to be only for a few years, the government had a lot of trouble hiring quality employees to carry out the quote-unquote economic stabilization programs, as it didn't come with job security. Economists were especially unwilling to participate, unsurprisingly, even though they were arguably the most important experts to hire for a program like this. So they weren't just government bureaucrats, they were underqualified government bureaucrats. An absolute dream. These price controls were a massive overstepping of government power. First of all, you shouldn't have to ask the government whether or not you can raise prices in a free market economy. And second, there hadn't been price controls like this since World War II, during the largest crisis in history, and it didn't even work then. And the US wasn't even doing that badly. Inflation was only at about 5%, and unemployment was at 6%. Hardly a World War II-like crisis. And they were not set to expire until after Nixon's first term in office in 1972, presumably as a way to help him get reelected if people wanted the price controls to continue. Nixon was also the one who took the world off the gold standard by breaking up Bretton Woods in August of 1971, another questionable step that led to constant monetary issues in the 1970s. Many people already thought the dollar was overvalued, and multiple countries were redeeming it for America's gold. But before the issue could manifest into a full-out run on the dollar, Nixon took it off the gold standard. But more on this later. Nixon was afraid of a recession, and he wanted a big win in the polls by any means necessary. So he instructed Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns to keep interest rates low and the money flowing to make it look like the economy was doing better than it actually was. And it worked. The economy didn't crash. Unemployment stayed pretty low at about 5.3%, and inflation even lower at 3.3% in 1972, even with mountains of problems piling up in the background. Also, the price controls and economic policies were actually very well received by the American people, with about 3/4 of the country favoring it in the polls. So they re-elected Nixon in a landslide, wanting more of that sweet, sweet Keynesian socialist economic planning. However, this is when things really took a turn for the worse. All those problems caused by economic controls masking the true state of the economy started to shine through, and inflation and unemployment began to rise after Nixon's re-election. In 1973, inflation increased to about 8.8% and made Nixon's price controls look even more appealing. Nixon and the government blamed these problems on foreign price gougers, money speculators, betting against the US dollar, and, of course, corporate greed. But these were clearly not the causes of the issues. Yes, the dollar value was slashed because of foreign speculators causing a devaluation, but that's only because the price was actually overvalued after the dollar was taken off of the gold standard. Blaming these people would be like getting mad at investors for selling a stock that is clearly and openly overvalued. This was not some plot to reduce the value of the dollar. Its value was below market price, and it was naturally leveling out to its real value. Also, the idea of corporate greed causing the majority of nationwide inflation is kind of a backwards idea, even without any understanding of how inflation is caused. I mean, good luck getting all of the competing corporations in the entire country to work together in a full-on cartel to raise prices without any of them taking advantage of a chance to be the only corporation with low prices. This would be like the craziest price-fixing conspiracy ever. Actually, this is why cartels even in specific industries barely ever work. Because someone always sees a chance to make a bunch of money by providing cheaper services, which leads to more business and more consumer trust funneled into the company that is willing to break the cartel's rules. Usually, cartels tend to only work if government regulations or corruption actively promotes them. It's possible that companies using an algorithm to set prices could have the same effect as cartel price fixing, which was a Soviet idea from the 1980s actually. This ironically has been co-opted in recent years by separate companies attempting to maximize profits with the same algorithms, which is a problem. However, even that could not increase inflation to the degree of the 1970s, because these algorithms are designed to change prices based on existing demand. They don't magically put money in the hands of buyers, which is one of the only ways to increase overall demand and prices. Anyways, I digress. The Yom Kippur War in 1973 made inflation even worse, with OPEC imposing an oil embargo on the United States for about a year in retaliation for its support of Israel, which made it much more difficult to scale back the price controls. So, unsurprisingly, Nixon doubled down and signed the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act in November of 1973, putting maximum price controls on petroleum products, and he again put another freeze on all prices in June of 1973. By this time, Nixon's economic planning policies had led the country into the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. But regardless of this, even after Nixon's impeachment due to the Watergate fiasco, the price controls and inflationary monetary policy continued with his Vice President Gerald Ford taking over. Typical. In addition to the crippling recession, the price controls began to cause all of the major gasoline shortages of the 1970s, and it affected a ton of other industries as well, with ranchers not selling cattle as it wasn't profitable, and farmers drowning chickens because it wasn't worth the money to feed them and sell them, which all led to shortages that resulted in empty shelves at supermarkets. These shortages became a constant systemic issue throughout the 1970s, and it was clear to many that the price controls were not working. Actually, Exxon CEO L.G. Rull told the Senate Interior Committee hearings on fuel shortages in 1973 that the years of price controls had been causing the gasoline shortages. So this wasn't like a secret or something. However, the government decided to keep doubling down with more price controls and new regulations that were passed between 1973 and 1980. Also, in 1979, Iran ousted the Shah, tanking its oil production, so OPEC raised oil prices, leading to further panic, just in time for the effects of US price controls to reach their peak. Between 1973 and 1979, people were scared, and the news of an oil embargo, rising prices, and the fear of real scarcity led drivers to fill up their tanks as much as possible whenever they could, just in case gasoline suddenly disappeared from the market. This mixture of ignorant panic and government control ramped up the gasoline shortage. Because of artificially lowered prices, people had little problem affording gas, and gas stations were being mobbed by drivers, inevitably selling out in a matter of hours. This allowed gas stations to close down earlier, to save on paying gas station attendants' wages, as a way to recuperate the losses caused by artificially lowered gas prices. In New York City, for example, the average gas station was open for about 110 hours per week in September of 1978. And in June of 1979, in the heat of the gasoline shortage, they had reduced their hours to about 27 per week, less than 4 hours a day. Gas stations also often completely stopped taking credit cards from drivers, and stopped looking under the hood to check for problems, which, yes, they used to do that for you at the gas station. So instead of raising prices, they reduced or completely stopped offering other services that are not specified under the price controls, and they didn't bother maintaining a steady supply of gasoline throughout the day. Because that's what price controls do. Just like how rent control leads to a reduction in services that are not specified under the law, like how frequent maintenance, hot water, heating, and air conditioning have historically been much less common in apartments with heavy rent control. So, one way or another, you'll be paying for what you buy. There are no solutions in economics, only trade-offs. Reducing hours at gas stations didn't just come with an adjustment. It completely changed the economy, because drivers were unsure of whether gas stations would be open at certain times. Planning long-distance trips became incredibly difficult, and this can be seen by the large decrease in the amount of business at vacation resorts around the country. It also greatly increased the price of goods that needed to be transported by truck. And you can only imagine all of the other ways in which this would disrupt an economy completely dependent on gas-powered vehicles and long-distance travel. This was also a big problem for everyday people just driving down the street who were going about life as if they were not living in the Soviet Union. If these drivers ran out of gas, they would be left stranded without any way to fill up. You might say, at least people were getting cheap gas as inflation was going up. That must count for something, right? And yes, the gas was slightly cheaper than it would be otherwise. But because of the other problems caused by price controls, like waiting in long lines and paying for tow trucks for cars that ran out of gas, people were likely paying much more than they normally would. For example, if you were driving around today and you needed to fill up 10 gallons of gas and your gasoline was at a fixed price of $4 per gallon, but the market price of gas was $5 per gallon, the price controls would be saving you $1 per gallon, making your final price $40 for 10 gallons of gas instead of $50. But if you have to wait in line for an hour or more, which was very common in 1979, and your time was worth $20 an hour, then you would have to add that to your bill, making it $60. So you're actually paying $10 more for that tank of gas than you would under normal market conditions, where your bill would be $50 with no line at any time of day. And that's not counting the stress of thinking there won't be any gas left when you get to the pump, or not being able to get gas because you're always at work when the pumps are open, or having to pay for a tow truck when your car runs out of gas. So by reducing the amount of time that gas stations are open and increasing the amount of time you sit in line, the gas station saves money on man hours and you lose it. As a matter of fact, maybe over 100 people will have to lose that hour, if that many people are waiting in line. If all 100 of those people in line are worth $20 an hour, that's $2,000 in waiting, so a gas station can save on the losses caused by price controls. Chances are your time is worth much more than $20 an hour, so likely this number is even higher. That's an hour you could spend with your friends, your kids, your significant other, or doing whatever else you want to do. This gasoline shortage was so confusing to the country that there were multiple investigations launched to figure out where all of the gasoline was going, leading to multiple conspiracy theories accusing oil companies of allowing tankers from the Middle East to wait in the ocean until prices increased before coming to shore to sell off their oil. Obviously, this was not happening. Actually, gasoline production only went down by a small amount, and gas stations were selling nearly the same amount of gas. Both only went down by a few percent. So everyone was looking for where the gasoline went and who was responsible for the shortages, but they forgot to look in their own full gas tanks or at their ridiculous economic controls. The fact is, none of these price controls were necessary. It was just a way to get quote-unquote good numbers on a bureaucrat's clipboard, to follow daddy government's rules and have faith that it's all for the best. If prices were allowed to rise, it would reduce the amount of gasoline consumption naturally, which would lead to less people taking every chance they had to fill up, reducing shortages and the panic they cause. I mean, honestly, what's better, slightly cheaper gas that you need to wait in an hour-long line for between the hours of 8 a.m. and 12 p.m., or more expensive gas whenever you want it? I might ask the same thing about anything else. What if all restaurants were only open for 4 hours a day, or grocery stores, or hospitals, or if you could only use energy for 4 hours a day because the power companies were trying to save money on some new regulation that reduced how much carbon they were allowed to emit each day? It kind of sounds like living in a third world country, actually. Or, dare I say, a socialist country. Surprisingly, it was left-wing President Jimmy Carter who, after winning the 1978 election and inheriting the worst year of the gasoline shortage, actually mostly decontrolled the oil market in 1980, after 7 years of price control hell. By 1979, unemployment was at about 15.7%, and by 1980, inflation rose as high as 14%, with the Fed constantly pumping money into the economy. This all led to another predictable recession in 1980. The 1970s has often gone by two iconic names, neither of them good: the Lost Decade and the Great Inflation. Many investors have called it the Lost Decade because there was so little growth during this time due to monetary policies that masked a major depression. Between 1970 and 1979, the S&P grew at about 1.6% per year on average, one of the slowest decades in history, with its highest peak in 1973. So if you bought the S&P at its peak in 1973, you would have had to wait 13 years until 1986 to get your money back. Nice. Possibly more relevant to this story, though, the 1970s and part of the 60s were called the Great Inflation because the value of the dollar plummeted to about 2/3 between 1965 and 1982, and by more than half just in the 1970s due to overzealous monetary interventions started by Richard Nixon. Unfortunately, we are still carrying some of the ridiculous regulations that the 1970s gave us, including the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Laws, or CAFE laws, which punish automakers who make smaller cars for having low fuel efficiency more than they do for large trucks. These regulations basically deleted an entire category of vehicle and flooded the entire market with SUVs and full-size trucks that are not as regulated, leading to higher overall fuel consumption, doing exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to do. These laws are why there's no such thing as a mid-sized truck in the United States anymore, even though it would undoubtedly use less gas. To this day, many people choose to blame the shortages, inflation, and recessions of the 1970s on the Middle East, corporate greed, and money speculators. And it would be wrong to say that the oil embargo and rising oil prices had no effect, as they clearly increased the price of gas. And also consumer prices went up as well. But the fact is that inflation was rising everywhere, including for wages. That doesn't sound very greedy. It just sounds like general inflation. Also, again, corporations do not change the money supply. The only organization that is powerful enough to increase inflation and cause shortages at this rate is the government, through changing the money supply, price controls, or creating regulations. The economic planning policies of Nixon, Ford, and Carter that created such a major disaster in the 1970s are clear examples of this. And today, with inflation issues and future economic hardships on the horizon, we can only hope that the US government doesn't attempt to repeat the past in its infinite hubris. Anyways, that's everything. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you like this video, and check out my sources in the description if you'd like, and feel free to help us out with a tip to our Ko-Fi. If you're a creator struggling to make content, check out Dangsphere in the link in the description, a production meets marketing company that helps creators turn their stories into content that grows their audience and business. And of course, stay free.